Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. It's good to see you guys. Today we're going to be jumping into Marmoset Toolbag 4 as I want to show off some of my tips and tricks and my pipeline for creating my renders for my portfolio when it comes to doing materials and things like that. My hope is that you'll learn some new stuff today. Let's go ahead and jump into it. I'm excited to show you guys. Alrighty, so I took off my sweatshirt because we're going to get super serious. We're going to do a bunch of rendering. It's going to get real hot. So you just wanted to make sure I cool down nice and efficiently. But here we are in Marmoset Toolbag 4. If you've never loaded into it, this is kind of the general layout for rendering, at least. They have some different stuff that they've included since Toolbag 3, including being able to do textures and materials and things like that. What we're going to be mostly concerned with today is just the rendering scene stuff as of now. So you can see right here up in the top left, you'll find kind of where all of the items and things that are in your scene currently, that's where they'll be living. Sorry. You can have, when you have things selected, there'll be some different settings and stuff for them that show up here. Down here we have our timeline. On the right here is where our materials window will be. We'll be creating different materials by dragging in textures and things like that over to these guys here, and then we can go ahead and apply into 3D geometry. So actually, the first thing we're gonna have to do is bring in some 3D stuff that we can show our materials on. And I've actually created a sphere. I'll show you how that all works in Maya, and I'll also provide that as a downloadable file, FBX, so that you can also use that for your own renders if you'd like it. So now that we're over here in Maya, just to show off the sphere really quickly, basically all you can see is it's just a normal sphere that has points. It has poles at the top and bottom, but is mostly otherwise uniformly divided. And if we go up here to the UV editor and look at this here, you can see that, that it's just basically the same sphere is stretched across 2 UV tiles, which means that basically by default, you can see this is one side of the sphere and this is the other side of the sphere, that there'll be the same texture halfway down the sphere. So if you look at it like a semicircle or a half circle, 2 half circles basically that are demonstrating our texture twice. So now we're back here in Marmoset. Let's go ahead and get kind of just set up so that we can start messing with things. We'll go ahead and bring in our 3D model. We'll bring in our textures and make a material, and then we'll apply that material to the model. So we can start here just by dragging and dropping our FBX into the viewport here. And you'll see that it'll place it right at the origin of the scene, which is great. It's exactly what we want. You can see it also did import a material with it. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that, and we'll just work with the default material here. I'm going to double click and rename this one to just tutorial. You can obviously name it to whatever you would like. It's arbitrary and it's just more for your own housekeeping. Now let's go ahead and change some of the settings about our material here just before we start bringing textures in. The first thing we're going to do is go to our normal map here, and we're going to hit the flip Y. That's because most cases you're going to be using OpenGL. It's a matter of OpenGL versus DirectX when you're baking your normal map or using your normal map, and that's just a matter of basically which direction the green channel is flipped. So that flip Y will toggle that. So if your normal doesn't look correct, that might be something you can change to fix that. Albedo's good. We're going to go down to, actually go up to displacement here and change that to height because I am working with the height map. And then roughness is good, metalness is good. I'm also working with an emissive texture, so I'm going to turn that on. And then I'm also going to turn occlusion on so that we can work with AO here. Now, it's just a matter of plugging in our maps. So I'll go ahead and bring those in real quick. You literally just plug in them exactly where they go. So you go height for the displacement, normal for the normal map, albedo or base color for that, roughness, metalness, emissive texture, and AO. Now that we have all of our textures gone and plugged in, we can see them actually represented on our 3D model here. If you're not currently seeing that, that just means you need to apply the material to it. You might have like the default material still in here, and it might just be showing the white material on your 3D model. So go ahead and just click and drag your new material to the 3D model, and it will update. So now that we have our material set up, the first thing we're going to do before we get into lighting or anything like that is actually going to be trying to find the correct angle that we want to be viewing this material from that will put it in its best light. And there's a few things that you can change to really get different effects that you might be looking for. One of those is going to be if you go to your material and you actually change the displacement scale here, you can see that that will push the material further in its displacement, which will really give that silhouette a unique shape, so that you're not just messing with a flat sphere, which will really just push the dynamicism and the interest of that material a little bit further. Now you're going to see that when you increase the scale, you're really going to see the dramatic effect of having too low polygons will be for that, because it is actually pushing and pulling vertices. So you're going to want to go ahead and click on your sphere, and you're going to checkbox this subdivide, and then you'll want to mess with the levels just to see how much you need to divide it to be able to get the resolution for your divisions, for your displacement that you need. Be careful with this, because it is increasing the vertice count as you're doing this, obviously. So the higher the subdivision level, the heavier it's going to be on your PC trying to render and move things around. So if you're noticing a little bit of lag trying to move around that, you might need to find a balance between quality and what you can run on your machine by turning that subdivision level up and down. Another thing that we can do to change the look pretty drastically here is if you go to your camera, we have this field of view option, and what this is essentially doing is kind of like a fisheye lens effect. If you go, I tend to go, so I think the default is about 45. If you go, for example, to up to 60, and then you zoom back in, you can see that things get closer to the camera further, and things that are far away from the camera seem to get pushed back, so it kind of elongates your view, which can make your material look a lot more dramatic by having kind of parts come at the camera really intensely, and then things kind of being away from the camera are less intense and further away. So that can give you a wholly different look just by changing the field of view on that. And then the final thing we have control over here is the texture tiling. So if you go up to your material and you go to the texture tab here, we can change this to something like 2, and maybe we'll reduce this a little bit. And you can see that with the increased tiling amount of our texture, we're getting a little bit more, we're getting a different sense of scale that might be more in line with what we want to showcase about our material. So just messing with those 3 settings, you can see that we got a pretty different look that already looks a lot nicer and really puts our material in a good light, even before we've gotten to composition of lighting setups and things like that. Just changing a few quick, simple settings really gave us a great foundation to build on top of. This next part's going to require a bit of trial and error for your specific material. I can show you some concepts and the tools that are available to you in Marmoset, just so that we have an understanding of how they work and how we can manipulate them to get the look that we're looking for with our materials. So by default, every Marmoset file has a sky in it, which is going to be very similar to an HDRI image that's being used to light and give color and reflection to our environment. You can choose from a variety of images that are already in Marmoset here to use to light your scene. So for example, if I download and then use this one, you can see that the lighting situation changes entirely, and this is all just from an image. And it's basically sampling stuff to be able to light your image. Imagine that this is just a giant sphere that's rotating around your scene. You can hold down Shift and right click and drag to rotate that view. So this is kind of an interesting image, just a little bit different. You can see that it's giving like a nice highlight over here, which is allowing us to have some nice shadow here. Maybe we could use a light or something like that to give a nice like rim light or something over here. But that's kind of a nice foundational tool that we can use to give some life and some color and some lighting to our scene. And then we can follow that up by using the different light options to be able to add some interest by kind of sculpting with light, if that makes sense, by adding highlights in certain areas. We can also change things that'll make our shadows harder or softer, and then also mess with things that'll make our highlights kind of shape more that we like. So I've decided to use this image for my sky, and I've messed with it and got the brightness and stuff where I want it to be relatively, and you can always come and adjust this later after you add in lights. That's where I'm going to leave it for now, and then I'm going to show you we're actually going to add in a couple of lights. So I have one light here that's a directional light, and then one that's an Omni light, and I'll explain those in a second. If I go ahead and enable these, you can see that this is kind of going from our foundational lighting that's just coming from the sky right now, and then I'm going to go ahead and add on these 2 lights here. And you can see we got a nice pop of like a cooler color coming up here. And then we have a bit of a light that's more warm down here. That's going to, it's nice for framing, kind of giving, especially like if you have a darker background, it'll kind of separate it from the background a little bit by giving it some color around the ridge there, which is cool. I find that when I want to mess with lighting and stuff like that, it can be kind of difficult to rotate and maneuver the lights when you kind of have your established shot here. Like this is kind of where I want my camera to stay because this is what I want my final look to be. So what you can actually do is if you hit this square up here, and then if you don't already have another camera, you can see I have another camera already in the scene. But if you don't, you go ahead and go to cameras, and then there's a new camera button here, which will create a camera, and then you can actually rotate around this separately from here. which is great. So you can see that there is a camera like little icon here. That is the camera that we're seeing. So if I was to move this, you can see that that is updating in real time, just for safety, I guess, so things don't change. I'm gonna go ahead and lock that. And then you can see my lights here. So I have a directional light that's actually coming up here. And the way a directional light works is that it's infinitely pointing in one direction. So if I was to rotate this, you can see that it's actually changing where it's on the pointing on the left there, and it actually has no standing on where it actually is in the scene, because it's more of it's a bunch of points infinitely pointing in one direction from infinity away. It's very similar. It's meant to be indicative or used as if it was a sunlight. So it can be nice to give you like a really strong key light in your scene, and then you want to use other things to kind of fill in the void. I might actually even move this guy back here just to be a bit more of a rim light and not flood the front of the sphere too much. And then that actually gives you another example, another chance to showcase the shape. You can either work with a rectangle or a sphere shape for your the shape of your light. And what that's going to do, you can see here that this has now become like a very like harsh light. There's no fall off on the shadows. It's got very bright highlights here, but if I was to up this, you can see that it kind of like softens the glow. It's coming from a larger radius. So it's imagine like if you had a really strong flashlight that was just pointing at one little area, versus having I don't know if you've ever seen like a light that they use on scenes, like a panel light where it's diffused through it. And so it's taking that light source and it's spreading it out over a larger area. So it's going to dim the light a little bit, but it's also going to soften that light so it's not such a harsh highlight and it has softer shadows. The Omni light actually is, if you imagine it's the point light and then all points are just coming out from that. So imagine that, like, I can even show you, if I was to copy this guy and move it here, you can see that it's lighting both this and that, because it's literally just, it's the source of light and it's all just kind of going out in infinite directions away from it. And then the third type, I haven't used one here, but just so that we have an idea of what it actually does, is a spotlight, which will actually produce light in a cone. So instead of being infinite like the Omni light, it only casts light in the direction of the things that are inside this cone here. So if I was to turn this away from the sphere, you'll see that it's no longer lighting it when it's facing away, and there's a bit of a fall off there. So when I'm doing my lighting, I like to keep in mind that it's good to have a dynamic range of value. And that means that we have highlights, we have mid-ranges, and we have our shadows. Because you can see that it's actually, we're using mostly this directional light here. It's giving us a nice highlight in the top left there, but it's also giving us all this shadow here, and it's really informing us what the shape of the height and the normal map is doing for our surface. So it's giving us the ability to actually see what the material is doing, versus if I was to go ahead and rotate this so that it's facing and mostly lighting just the entirety of the front here, it just is not as interesting to look at as far as I'm concerned, and it kind of flattens the material, and you don't get as much complexity and interest being told by the shadows. So personally, I like to kind of mess. Typically, it's either from the top left or top right. I'll have a light here to give the nice shadow coming downwards, and then I'll play with having a rim light or something like that to, again, kind of separate it from the background and add some color. Trying to keep in mind scenario that the material might actually be in. You want to mess with colors that make sense for the material. For in this case, you can imagine obviously it's going to be near a lava pool, so I could go for something like a really extreme red scene, maybe make it a little bit orangier to like really sell the context of this. I personally liked it having a little bit of that blue, just to be able to have some contrasting colors, and kind of imagining having like a really like pale like day, and then having this guy be more in line with what would be seen around a lava field of some kind. Now, once we have the lighting where we want it, we have a few other tools at our disposal to kind of finalize the final render of our piece. That includes maybe adding a backdrop, and I'll show you a couple different ways that you can do that. So in Marmoset, there's actually a backdrop object that you can drop into your scene that will essentially tie a backdrop to your camera, so that no matter where I zoom around, here if you look around, it stays in place and just serves as a backdrop to our scene. This can be really nice and easy in a pinch if you just want something simple and you don't want to work with the sky colors or do any kind of work in Photoshop or something after the fact to make your own background. You can just use this to keep something consistent. What I don't like about this is that it doesn't impart any color or anything into the scene. And what I've actually found is if you drop in like a plane, for example, and maybe apply the same material to it, you can blur that out with some depth of field, and then you can also have it use some bounce lighting to add more color to the scene if you want to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up now, and I'll show you that in just a second. Okay, so I'll actually walk you through what I've done here, just so you can see. But what you can see right now is the effect is basically similar, that there is kind of a backdrop here, but instead of having it be a backdrop object that just kind of is showing a flat image to the camera, what I've actually done is brought in a plane here. So if I zoom way out here, you can see that there's this giant plane with our material applied to it compared to our sphere here that has the material that's kind of our showcase material. What I did is I went and duplicated our material so that I could apply a new instance of it to our plane, and then I could edit the settings here, just so that you can find some settings that you like better for the flat plane, and it doesn't affect your main material showcase render sphere. And so I've dropped in a plane here. I have done similar things that I did to the sphere by adding it to subdivide, just in case I wanted to mess with some of the displacement and stuff like that. You can see that we're getting this orange highlight here because it actually is bouncing off of this plane. Like light is literally hitting that plane and then bouncing onto our object, and it's imparting some of the orange that's there. So you can even use this as a new set piece to add a little bit of color by just using some like global illumination essentially. Something like that looks really nice, where it's just kind of like this really soft glow. And if you really don't want that to be there, if you don't want it to be in the camera, but you might still want the color from it, you can hit this invisible to camera button that's active if you click on the geometry that will hide it to the camera, which is kind of just a cool, nice feature. And then you can see that I've blurred it out by going to the camera and going, if you go down to focus here, and then you turn on depth of field, you can use the post process, but I prefer to do ray trace just because you get some nice, more accurate results. And then you can work with what's basically like a camera f-stop here. And then you can either use this to adjust your focus distance, or you can actually go ahead and middle mouse click on a point on your sphere, or in the back here, oops, and it'll change the focus to wherever you click. So if I want it to be focused, usually I'll hit like right in the center of the sphere, since it's obviously going to be the closest thing to the camera typically. And then that will update your focus distance on the fly here. If you see it down here in the bottom left there, that's changing. So we'll focus on our sphere here, and then you can change this to get more or less blur of that background image. Something like that's nice, where you get some rounded, softened edges on your sphere here, and then it kind of pushes the background into the background, which is really cool. While also getting that effect of having that plane actually imparting some of the color into your scene, which is just all really cool. So let's jump into doing some of the post-processing stuff that I was talking about. If you click on your camera here, you have options of changing your depth of field here. This is also like we did before, where you can change your field of view, which might give you some different looks that it's maybe good to tweak now that you've got more stuff done. And then you can see there's even some interesting things you can do with like the bokeh, which is what happens when things are out of focus. What kind of light are they making? You can see how when the highlights are getting out of focus, you're seeing this like heart shape here. That's what that does. Or you can do a star, or there's a bunch of different ones you can do, or you can also upload your own. I think this soap bubble is very similar to the kind of bokeh you see on actual film cameras. So I'll probably go with something like that because that's kind of fun. And now if you look down here, there's distortion, which is where you can add some chromatic aberration, which is just another effect that kind of comes with on actual cameras and can make for a nicer looking render, but you have to be really subtle about it. So something even as low as like 0.1, where you don't even really see the effect. But basically what it's doing is it's offsetting the RGB color channels just by a couple pixels, just to basically show real world inaccuracy, what happens when light bounces in, that it's just slightly misaligned. So I can add some nice changes there. You can mess with the post-process the color. Sometimes working in a different color space is nice, so it's by default always going to be a linear color space, but sometimes I like to jump into the aces color space, which you obviously out of the gate can see gets a lot darker, but this is going to mimic, this is the same color space or same color gambit that Unreal Engine uses, for example. So if you want to be doing renders that are maybe more in line with what you would see in that game engine, then you could work from the beginning in tone mapping set to aces. But you can see, for example, aces has just a higher range of contrast. So there's still, we got these highlights from our colors here, but there's a much darker black than we had with the linear color. So if I was just going to do something like this without messing with the colors, maybe I'd up the exposure a little bit, maybe lower the contrast just a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of push and pull here. So really what I want to show with this video is just kind of the options you have at your availability, and then maybe some use cases of how I would approach them. But really, I think it's got to be up to you, and you'll kind of develop your artist's eye for what you want to do. That is my intent anyway. Some other of the post-process stuff that you can include is like sharpening, where like obviously again, if you blow it out, it's going to be kind of an unrealistic effect, but it can help to kind of line your details a lot nicer so that they stand out a bit more. You really don't want to be subtle. You want to be subtle about this effect and not do too much. There's bloom, which is basically your brightest points are going to kind of give off a glow, and the size of that will be how far offset from that it will be. Again, you want to be very subtle about this. I think it looks cheesy if you go too high on the bloom. Some other fun things you can mess with, there's film and digital grain, which is basically going to be this like noise that it's kind of like if you have your ISO on your camera too high, it'll add this like grit. I think by default it's not animated, so you can kind of see it here a little bit, but to kind of get the effect of what it would look like if it was in motion, you can see the little sparks coming up. And I hope I don't know if that's coming up on the YouTube channel, on the YouTube video, but it should be. You can change the coarseness of that grain till it's like ridiculous. We're going to go back down to here. Or you can go with our digital grain, which is also going to impart a little bit of color too, by the way. This doesn't just add noise. I think basically the difference between digital and film grain is that this is just a bunch of RGB dots rather than with film, it's just like black and white. I think that's the biggest difference between the two. That's kind of a lot of the things that you can do to adjust the camera once you've got your lighting and stuff set up. And again, there might be some back and forth where like you have your lighting set up and then you go into the post process and changing your camera settings and things like that. And then that might require you to go back to your lighting and adjust that a little bit. But so there's a lot of back and forth that you can use to really get the look that you want. So just so you're aware of some other little tips and tricks that you have available at your hands here, I'm going to go back into my material and we're going to take a look at the transmission shader here. So you can see I've actually applied a volumetric scattering part to my shader here. And I'm just using my emissive material and then an inverted height map here. So you can actually see you literally just, I've grabbed the height and I've inverted it, so it's only applying to the lowest bits of my geometry because that just happens to be where my lava is in this case. You can obviously author a intentionally designed mask for this, and I have done that in other materials, which I'll show you in a second. And then for the color, you can either use a map, so here I've used my emissive color here, or you can turn that off and you can actually choose a color here. If I wanted it to be, I don't know, we'll say blue just for the fun of it. And then I turn up my scatter depth. Maybe we'll go as high as like crazy, like 500, just so you can see the effect. Those are some other options. You also can turn this from a volumetric shader to a subsurface shader. I'm not smart enough to really actually tell you what is actually different between these two. But so those might just be two options that you have at your disposal to try and change. You also can work with Fuzz here, which is basically going to be very similar to like a Fresnel effect. It's meant to be mimicking like microfibers and things like that so that there's little hairs that are catching light. But it's basically similar to a Fresnel effect where anything at the edge of the material that's facing most away from the camera at a 90-degree angle is going to be lit up. And again, you can choose either color for that or you can use a mask for that as well. And then also you can mess with clear coat here. So we can turn on clear coat reflectivity and clear coat reflection. We'll set it anisotropic. And microsurface, we'll set that to roughness. So this is basically going to be like a second pass at roughness that's going to be laid over the top. So you can imagine there's like two passes that lighting is going to go through. This is very similar for like car shaders and things like that, where basically on the bottom you have kind of that metallic, sometimes it's kind of got the flake, like shiny sparkliness, and then you have the protective like ceramic coating over the top that is transparent, but it's going to reflect light differently. I'll go ahead and we're going to open up another example, but I'll show you where I was able to use clear coat and volumetric scattering in that pretty effectively. So this is like a parasitic alien, fleshy, gross, kind of like Flood from like Halo kind of material that I made actually for November last year. I don't actually remember what the prompt was at the time, but it is something I made for that. And you can see that I've used a bit of the clear coat, for example, here, just to give it a kind of that slime factor over the top, even though my roughness that I'm dealing with in this is actually not super reflective. It is definitely still reflective. It's still in like the 30% roughness range probably, but then that clear coat adds just that extra layer of reflectivity on top, which is kind of fun. So if I was to take my roughness and put it all the way up, you can see that there's kind of this like jammy effect to it now where it kind of looks like jello. But then I'm still gonna, here, if I go and change the clear coat roughness, it's hard to see with the noise and stuff like that. So it's really just something you have to go back and forth on. But basically I can change the clear coat roughness and the underlying roughness separately, and have it have two specular passes essentially, which is really cool. And then you can also see where I've used the volumetric scattering to some effect here. And I did intentionally create a scatter mask here that it's using just to get some different colors here. So I have kind of like this like blue and red kind of scattered throughout, that you can see it's more like purpley blue here from the mixing of the two, from light hitting and entering that surface here. Yeah, just a real gross material. I love it. You can also see here, just this is something that I wasn't able to showcase as well in the lava material, but you can see this is really important, how the shape of the light can really affect the highlights. So you can see that if I stretch it out, you're getting much wider, more broad highlights here, versus if I was to go for like a really thin light, it's literally the thinness of the highlight is actually reflecting the width of the material or of the light that I'm using. So let's say we're at a point now where we like our lighting, we like our camera settings, we like the final image that we're seeing, and now we're actually going to go ahead and make our first render, and I'll show you how to do that. If you go up to the render tab here, you can scroll down. There are some settings here that we've already messed with a little bit that you can continue to tweak, including these radiance clamps and the diffuse intensity and reflection. You can see this is the reflection intensity, which is basically like the lighting that's getting imparted onto the scene from indirect lighting. I think it's by default at 1 or something like that. And for me in this case, I wanted to bump it up a little bit so that the skylight and the light from like the plane, for example, is adding more information to the scene. That's another setting that you can tweak to get some uses that you want. So let's look here. This is the image output, and this is going to be where we're defining the pixel resolution of our scene, what file format we want it to save as, if we want to use denoising, and then also how many samples we actually want it to use. So I'll go ahead and throw up this. I made this like little graphic that will kind of showcase what you should be doing to balance your samples versus denoising usage. It's kind of an up to you kind of thing to figure out, but I think I found a bit of a sweet spot where it's good in that it'll give you the quality that you want, that you're seeing in the engine, you're seeing in Marmoset, while also not taking forever to render, and also denoising, if you do it incorrectly, can actually wipe out a lot of the detail in your material by literally taking away the noise that's supposed to be there. So if I go ahead and bring this over here, if I have my denoising set to, I'm using 1 pixel sample, but I have my denoising on and only 1 sample being set, you can see this is the result I get with denoising and this is the result without. Both are kind of terrible for their own reasons. You get obviously a lot of noise without denoising, but also everything has been blurred to heck on the denoising, because with only 1 sample, there just wasn't enough information to actually like get that crispness before the denoising went in. So a lot of the stuff that it thinks is just noise, it's then actually blurring out. If I go continue to the side here, you can see I'm adding more samples, and obviously immediately we're seeing more resolution in our image on the left side here. But it's still pretty blurred out, and we're still getting some noise on the right here. If we go up to 8 samples, similar thing. There's a jump in quality, a little bit less noise on the right side here. Basically what I found was that if I get up to about 256, the left side image, the denoising doesn't wipe out much detail. You can obviously go higher in samples if you still want to, if it's still like the really, really tiny details are still getting wiped out. It might be good to go up to 512 or even 1K samples, and then use denoising, because you can see that even at like 256 samples, we're still getting some spottiness here. And actually, I'll even go all the way up to 2K here. There's still some noise going on. So you'd have to go to like a ridiculous amount of samples to actually get rid of all of that if you're going for a high resolution image. In this case, these are 2K images. that I'm rendering, and you can see that I get a pretty solid effect. Like this is the best of the best for sure on the left here if I'm using that many samples while also still using denoising, because we're basically getting all the detail in there, but all these little leftover pixel noise bits that are getting left over when we have denoising off are then being wiped out by denoising. But because we have enough rendered detail there, that it doesn't look just like noise to the AI that's denoising, it takes away just the things that need to be taken away. But you can even see if we just pay attention to the left here, there's hardly any difference between these two. You can see some highlights that maybe get a little bit stronger with 2K versus 1K, but ultimately the effect is diminishing the higher in samples we go. So that's where I found about 256. You can see even between 512 and 256, the effect is pretty diminished from there. So that's where I've decided that for me, typically, if I'm rendering at about 2000 by 2000 pixels, a sample size of 256 with the denoising set on is my preferred method. So jumping back into Marmoset here, we'll go ahead and go back to our render and set that up here. I'm going to set my sample size to 256. I'm going to have a format size or format type of PNG. So once you have all these settings correct, you want to choose where you want it to go. And then you just hit render image, and you'll see that it'll pop up with a render here. And depending on the power of your PC and the settings that you use, it'll still take a varied amount of time. But you can see mine is just about done here. We'll pop that image up. You can also hit F11 at any point when you're in Marmoset, and it'll do the exact same thing. You can see this, and I think even at the same time, it'll do the caveat of actually opening up the image for you once it's done. So here you can see we finished, and here's our first render. This is a great to get kind of a final version that you can then see if there's things that you want to tweak a little bit. For me, I'm seeing that maybe my strength is a little bit, or the sharpness is a little bit too strong, so I might back that off a little bit. As well as maybe I don't want it to be as blurry as it currently is. So those are a couple little tweaks that I might make. But again, this is just a part of that back and forth process of like setting up what you think you want to look like, and then just keep messing with it until you really dial it into what you want. So something that I like to include in my portfolio renders is actually sometimes a turntable where you're actually seeing a movement of the material, usually doing like a 360 turntable render. And that's actually very easy to do in Marmoset. So let me go ahead and show you how you do that. First, we're going to go ahead and select the sphere. We're going to go up to Scene, Add Object, and then Add Turntable. And you can see that it's now put the sphere as an object of the turntable. And if we adjust the timeline here, you can see that it's now spinning the sphere. What's really neat about the specific geometry that we're using is that because it's two-sided, we can save some render time. It'll still make a looping video without having us needing to render frames that would essentially be duplicates. So for example, we don't need it to do a 360 revolution, we need it to do a 180 revolution, because as soon as it ticks over that 181, it's actually going to look the exact same as 1 degree as 181. So what I like to do here is figure out how many frames per second I want my render to be. Typically I go with 30. And then I want to figure out about how long I want my render to last. So if I want a full rotation to be about 10-15 seconds, what I'll do is I'll set my timeline here to, or we'll say 10 seconds. I'm going to set my timeline to 20 seconds here. Just hit yes, because it's going to reframe that at a spin rate of 30. We'll go ahead and hit sync loop speed, and that's going to now do 18 degrees per second. We'll come back down to our length and hit it at 10. Hit yes here. The spin rate will stay at 18, and then we'll go ahead and hit play. And while it's previewing in Marmoset, it's going to go into the gross view. It's like simplifying everything, but when you actually render, it won't look like this. And you can see as soon as we see it tick over, it now went back to the beginning of our timeline, but it was a seamless revolution here if we watch one more time. So that's just a little quick thing that I figured it just helps with a little bit, because obviously it's going to take some time to render each of these frames. It's got to render 300 frames, right? And so just to make it a little bit simpler, that's a nice thing. You can also, even if you really want to shortcut it even further, if you have a texture tiling of 2, I believe you can even get away with going down to like 5 seconds here, and it should still be the exact same. Let's watch. I could be wrong about this, but it would make sense. Yeah, so you could even save it. You can go down to 150 frames. And then if you're making something like a GIF, or if you wanted something, if it was in a format that it was going to be looped anyway, that just makes sense to really just save yourself on rendering frames that otherwise is going to take way too long. So now I'll show you how I actually render out videos in Marmoset. You can just do video files. I could render it out as an MP4, but I find that if I ever have to pause the render for some reason, then I have to render it all over again. Also, I don't get any kind of like a preview of what it's looking like while it's rendering it. And so to solve those problems, what I actually like to do is go back up to render here. Similarly to the way we set up our image, we're going to set up where we want to save it. I set my resolution to 2000 by 2000, and I'm going to set my format to PNG. We're going to do a PNG sequence. I'm going to set the compression quality all the way up to 100 because we don't want to worry about compression here. We'll worry about compression in our in our program later when we're actually stitching all these images together, because essentially what we're going to be doing is creating an image sequence, and then we'll have, in my case, I'm going to use Adobe Media Encoder to stitch that together. So we'll go ahead and you know what, just because I'm feeling fancy because we were able to get down to 150 frames, I'm going to go ahead and up the samples to 512, format PNG, samples 512, denoise is at CPU, we'll set that quality to high with the full on strength. I'm actually going to go ahead and decide to lower my resolution to 1000 by 1000 just because rendering at a 2K video is a little bit intense. You could still do like 1440 by 1440 if you wanted it to essentially be 2K, because that's the height of a 2K video. And then, now we'll go ahead and hit render video once we have all of our other settings correct. And what I'll show you now is you'll see this bar is going to keep ticking up with green. Here's the folder where I have my stuff saved, and you can actually see that it saves out each image individually. So what's nice about this is that you can actually go and preview what that image looks like, and obviously you're not going to see a lot of change between the two images. It's just rotating slightly, but this gives you a good preview of the quality that's going to actually be what you expect to see after the fact. And if there's anything that you see that you don't like, then it's good to go and maybe stop that render, delete these, go make the tweaks that you need to do, and then try it all over again and see if there's anything that you need to do. So I'll come back to you once this is done, and I'll show you how we're actually going to go ahead and stitch this together in Adobe Media Encoder. Marmoset is finished rendering out our 150 frames of our 5-second animation. So now we're going to go ahead and open up Adobe Media Encoder. There are other programs you can use. This is just going to be the one I'm going to show you with some tips on what to keep in mind specifically. So if I go ahead and drag Media Encoder over here, what we're going to do is we're going to hit this plus sign to basically start a new job. And you can see now here's our 150 renders once again. We can just select the first one and hit open. And because they're named in sequential order, Adobe Media Encoder is going to automatically recognize that there are 150 PNGs that are a part of the sequence. I've created a PNG sequence stitcher like preset here, but just to show you some of the things, I'm going to make sure that you are familiar with things that you need to check for. You want to make sure that the frame rate matches whatever you rendered out of Marmoset. So in this case, we set our frame rate to 30. And then you also want to come down here and you can either set it to CBR, which stands for constant bit rate, or you can do variable bit rate with a couple passes, whatever. You just want to make sure that your bit rate is pretty high, because if it's not, it's going to interpret a lot of that noise as really blurry. So just to fix that, I just basically max out my bit rate so that it's essentially rendering, it's just stitching the images together without compressing them at all. Obviously, the higher your target bit rate is, the more that the bit rate is actually in that video, the higher the file size is going to be. So that is just one thing to keep in mind. But you can see that right here, our estimated file size is going to be just only 84 megabytes because it's just 150 images that we're stitching together. So it's only 5 seconds long. So those are the things to make sure you have your high bit rate, and you want your frame rate to be matching your image sequence. The other thing you can do is if I right click here and go to interpret footage, I can make sure that this use frame rate from file is set correctly. Sometimes with images it's going to incorrectly estimate that. So for example, if I did 60 FPS, 60 frames per second out of Marmoset, I would also want to make sure that's set correctly there, because otherwise you'll get ghosting and weird interpolation that it's trying to fix. So, but we're good here in that case. And then we're going to go ahead and hit play, and it's going to render this all out, and it'll put it into the same output file folder that we got our images from in the first place. And now that is done, we'll go ahead and open up and play it. And you can see that it's effectively stitched all of our images together. Then we'll let it play around, and you can see that it's a perfect loop as well. And this is great. So if you're on something like ArtStation, for example, now they have the ability to upload MP4s with a pretty high file size. I think of 250 megabytes is the limit, up to 4K if you're an ArtStation Pro member. And so that's just a really nice way to show how light can play on the surface of your material. That just gives it a whole different light that just one singular image doesn't really get away with for you. That can be another thing that you could add to your portfolio to really just sell the material in its best light. Let's go ahead and do a quick recap of the process that we learned in this video. First, we brought our geometry in. We made a new material and plugged our textures in. And then we started messing with the camera's FOV, as well as the texture, tiling, and offset to really get the look that we're wanting. We need to make sure that we know if we're using an emissive texture, if we want to use subsurface scattering or volumetric scattering. And then from there, we start messing with the skylight HDR to find a good base lighting scenario. We added directional lights, Omni Lights, and spotlights, and then we adjusted their shape and size to get shadows and highlights in effective places. Then we had to decide if we wanted to add a backdrop, either as a backdrop item or an actual plane that we dropped behind our material, or if we wanted to do compositing later in Photoshop. We could do camera effects like changing our tone mapping to ACES. We could add sharpening, bloom, grain noise, distortion, and depth of field effects from the camera. And then when it was time to render, we had to decide what the resolution of our image or video was going to be, and we had to set our sample count and our denoising settings. Again, my recommended settings for this were somewhere around 1440 to 2000 pixels square, and setting our samples to 256 or 512 with our denoising settings all the way on. And that's basically everything I have to cover about this program in this video. Thanks for sticking with me. I know this one was a little bit longer, but hopefully you learned something that you can apply to your own pipeline for making these renders that will just take your renders to the next level. Just kind of give that extra little bit of quality that they might have been missing. If you made it this far, there's a good chance that you'll probably like some of the other content that's on my channel. And of course, a subscription and a like on this video are always super helpful. If there's a topic that you'd like me to cover, feel free to leave it in the comments below. I'd love to know. We have a Discord community that we're trying to grow. If you take some of the information in this video and apply it to your own renders, feel free to share them. Come pop into the Discord and share them in there. We have a channel for that. And I'd love to see, how you apply the stuff that you learned in this video to your own portfolio. Other than that, hope you guys have a great day. Thank you so much for staying with me, and hope you learned something. See you next time.